CHAP. LIX. There are 1,000 resolutions, sir, both in church and state, as well as in matters, madam, of a more private concern, which, though they have carried all the appearance in the world of being taken, and entered upon in a hasty, hair-brained, and unadvised manner, were notwithstanding this, and could you or I have got into the cabinet or stood behind the curtain, we should have found it was so, weighed, poised, and perpended, argued upon, canvassed through, entered into, and examined on all sides with so much coolness, that the goddess of coolness herself, I do not take upon me to prove her existence, could neither have wished it or done it better. Of the number of these was my father's resolution of putting me into breeches, which, though determined at once, in a kind of huff and a defiance of all mankind, had nevertheless been pro'd and conned, and judicially talked over betwixt him and my mother about a month before, in 2 several beds of justice, which my father had held for that purpose. I shall explain the nature of these beds of justice in my next chapter. And in the chapter following that, you shall step with me, madam, behind the curtain, only to hear in what kind of manner my father and my mother debated between themselves this affair of the breeches, from which you may form an idea how they debated all lesser matters. CHAP. LX. The ancient Goths of Germany, who, the learned Cluverius is positive, were first seated in the country between the Vistula and the Oder, and who afterwards incorporated the Herculi, the Bugians, and some other Vandalic clans to them, had all of them a wise custom of debating everything of importance to their state, twice, that is, once drunk and once sober. Drunk, that their counsels might not want vigor, and sober, that they might not want discretion. Now my father, being entirely a water drinker, was a long time gravelled almost to death, in turning this as much to his advantage, as he did every other thing which the ancients did or said. And it was not till the 7th year of his marriage, after 1,000 fruitless experiments and devices, that he hit upon an expedient which answered the purpose. And that was, when any difficult and momentous point was to be settled in the family, which required great sobriety, and great spirit too, in its determination, he fixed and set apart the first Sunday night in the month, and the Saturday night which immediately preceded it, to argue it over, in bed with my mother. By which contrivance, if you consider, sir, with yourself, these my father, humorously enough, called his beds of justice. For from the 2 different counsels taken in these 2 different humors, a middle one was generally found out which touched the point of wisdom as well, as if he had got drunk and sober 100 times. I must not be made a secret of to the world, that this answers full as well in literary discussions, as either in military or conjugal. But it is not every author that can try the experiment as the Goths and Vandals did it, or, if he can, may it be always for his body's health. And to do it, as my father did it, am I sure it would be always for his soul, s. My way is this. In all nice and ticklish discussions, of which heaven knows there are but too many in my book, where I find I cannot take a step without the danger of having either their worships or their reverences upon my back, I write one half full, and t'other fasting, or write it all full, and correct it fasting, or write it fasting, and correct it full, for they all come to the same thing, so that with a less variation from my father's plan than my father S from the Gothic, feel myself upon a par with him in his first bed of justice, and no way inferior to him in his second. These different and almost irreconcilable effects flow uniformly from the wise and wonderful mechanism of nature, of which be hers the honor. All that we can do is to turn and work the machine to the improvement and better manufactory of the arts and sciences. Now, when I write full, I write as if I was never to write fasting again as long as I live. That is, I write free from the cares as well as the terrors of the world. I count not the number of my scars, nor does my fancy go forth into dark entries and by corners to antedate my stabs. In a word, my pen takes its course, and I write on as much from the fullness of my heart as my stomach. But when, and please your honors, I indite fasting, 'tis a different history. I pay the world all possible attention and respect, and have as great a share, whilst it lasts, of that understrapping virtue of discretion as the best of you. So that betwixt both, I write a careless kind of a civil, nonsensical, good-humored Shandian book, which will do all your hearts good. And all your heads too, provided you understand it. CHAP. LXI. We should begin, said my father, turning himself half round in bed, and shifting his pillow a little towards my mother, as he opened the debate, we should begin to think, Mrs. Shandy, of putting this boy into breeches. We should so, said my mother. We defer it, my dear, quoth my father shamefully. I think we do, Mr. Shandy, said my mother. Not but the child looks extremely well, said my father, in his vests and tunics. He does look very well in them, replied my mother. And for that reason it would be almost a sin, added my father, to take him out of 'em. It would so, said my mother. But indeed he is growing a very tall lad, rejoined my father. He is very tall for his age, indeed, said my mother. I cannot, making 2 syllables of it, imagine, quoth my father, who the deuce he takes after. I cannot conceive, for my life, said my mother. Humph, said my father. The dialogue ceased for a moment. I am very short myself, continued my father gravely. You are very short, Mr. Shandy, said my mother. Humph, quoth my father to himself, a second time, in muttering which he plucked his pillow a little further from my mother's, and turning about again, there was an end of the debate for 3 minutes and a half. When he gets these breeches made, cried my father in a higher tone, he'll look like a beast in 'em. He will be very awkward in them at first, replied my mother. And 'twill be lucky, if that's the worst on't, added my father. It will be very lucky, answered my mother. I suppose, replied my father, making some pause first, he'll be exactly like other people's children. Exactly, said my mother. Though I shall be sorry for that, added my father, and so the debate stopped again. They should be of leather, said my father, turning him about again. They will last him, said my mother, the longest. But he can have no linings to 'em, replied my father. He cannot, said my mother. 'Twere better to have them of fustian, quoth my father. Nothing can be better, quoth my mother. Except dimity, replied my father. 'Tis best of all, replied my mother. One must not give him his death, however, interrupted my father. By no means, said my mother, and so the dialogue stood still again. I am resolved, however, quoth my father, breaking silence the 4th time, he shall have no pockets in them. There is no occasion for any, said my mother. I mean in his coat and waistcoat, cried my father. I mean so too, replied my mother. Though if he gets a gig or top, poor souls. It is a crown and a scepter to them, they should have where to secure it. Order it as you please, Mr. Shandy, replied my mother. But don't you think it right? Added my father, pressing the point home to her. Perfectly, said my mother, if it pleases you, Mr. Shandy. There's for you. Cried my father, losing his temper, pleases me. You never will distinguish, Mrs. Shandy, nor shall I ever teach you to do it, betwixt a point of pleasure and a point of convenience. This was on the Sunday night, and further this chapter saith not. Chap. LXAI. After my father had debated the affair of the breeches with my mother, he consulted Albertus Rubenius upon it, and Albertus Rubenius used my father 10 times worse in the consultation, if possible, than even my father had used my mother. For as Rubenius had wrote a quarto express, de re vesciria veterum, it was Rubenius' business to have given my father some lights. On the contrary, my father might as well have thought of extracting the 7 cardinal virtues out of a long beard, as of extracting a single word out of Rubenius upon the subject. Upon every other article of ancient dress, Rubenius was very communicative to my father, gave him a full satisfactory account of the toga or loose gown, the chlamys, the ephod, the tunica or jacket, the synthesis, the pinula, the lacema with its cuculus, the paludimentum, the praedexta, the sagum or soldier's jerkin, the trabea, of which, according to Suetonius, there was 3 kinds. But what are all these to the breeches? Said my father. Rubenius threw him down upon the counter all kinds of shoes which had been in fashion with the Romans. There was the open shoe, the close shoe, the slip shoe, the wooden shoe, the soche, the buskin, and the military shoe with hobnails in it, which Juvenal takes notice of. There were the clogs, the pattens, the pantoufles, the brogues, the sandals with latchets to them. There was the felt shoe, the linen shoe, the lace shoe, the braided shoe, the calceus incisus, and the calceus rostratus. Rubenius showed my father how well they all fitted, in what manner they laced on, with what points, straps, thongs, latchets, ribands, jags, and ends. But I want to be informed about the breeches, said my father. Albertus Rubenius informed my father that the Romans manufactured stuffs of various fabrics, some plain, some striped, others diapered throughout the whole contexture of the wool, with silk and gold. That linen did not begin to be in common use till towards the declension of the empire, when the Egyptians coming to settle amongst them brought it into vogue. That persons of quality and fortune distinguished themselves by the fineness and whiteness of their clothes, which color next to purple, which was appropriated to the great offices, they most affected, and wore on their birthdays and public rejoicings. That it appeared from the best historians of those times that they frequently sent their clothes to the fuller to be cleaned and whitened, but that the inferior people, to avoid that expense, generally wore brown clothes and of a something coarser texture, till towards the beginning of Augustus' reign, when the slave dressed like his master. And almost every distinction of habiliment was lost, but the latus clavis. And what was the latus clavis? Said my father. Rubenius told him that the point was still litigating amongst the learned. That Ignatius, Sigonius, Bossius Ticinensis, Baefius Butius, Salmasius, Lipsius, Lazius, Isaac Casaubon, and Joseph Scaliger all differed from each other, and he from them, that some took it to be the button, some the coat itself, others only the color of it, that the great Baefues in his wardrobe of the ancients chap. 12 honestly said he knew not what it was, whether a tibula, a stud, a button, a loop, a buckle, or clasps and keepers. My father lost the horse, but not the saddle. They are hooks and eyes, said my father, and with hooks and eyes he ordered my breeches to be made. Chap. LXII. We are now going to enter upon a new scene of events. Leave we then the breeches in the tailor's hands, with my father standing over him with his cane, reading him as he sat at work a lecture upon the latus clavis, and pointing to the precise part of the waistband where he was determined to have it sewed on. Leave we my mother, truest of all the pococurantes of her sex, careless about it, as about everything else in the world which concerned her. That is, indifferent whether it was done this way or that, provided it was but done at all. Leave we slop likewise to the full profits of all my dishonors. Leave we poor Lefevre to recover and get home from Marseille as he can. And last of all, because the hardest of all, let us leave, if possible, myself, but 'tis impossible, I must go along with you to the end of the work. Chap. LXIV. If the reader has not a clear conception of the rood and the half of ground which lay at the bottom of my Uncle Toby's kitchen garden, and which was the scene of so many of his delicious hours, the fault is not in me, but in his imagination, for I am sure I gave him so minute a description, I was almost ashamed of it. When fate was looking forwards one afternoon into the great transactions of future times, and recollected for what purposes this little plot, by a decree fast bound down in iron, had been destined, she gave a nod to nature. 'Twas enough. Nature threw half a spade full of her kindliest compost upon it, with just so much clay in it as to retain the forms of angles and indentings, and so little of it too as not to cling to the spade and render works of so much glory. Nasty and foul weather. My Uncle Toby came down, as the reader has been informed, with plans along with him, of almost every fortified town in Italy and Flanders. So let the Duke of Marlborough, or the Allies, have set down before what town they pleased, my Uncle Toby was prepared for them. His way, which was the simplest one in the world, was this: as soon as ever a town was invested, but sooner when the design was known, to take the plan of it, let it be what town it would, and enlarge it upon a scale to the exact size of his bowling green, upon the surface of which, by means of a large roll of packthread and a number of small pickets driven into the ground, at the several angles and redans, he transferred the lines from his paper. Then taking the profile of the place, with its works, to determine the depths and slopes of the ditches, the talus of the glacis, and the precise height of the several banquets, parapets, and sea, he set the corporal to work, and sweetly went it on. The nature of the soil, the nature of the work itself, and above all, the good nature of my Uncle Toby sitting by from morning to night, and chatting kindly with the corporal upon past done deeds, left labor little else but the ceremony of the name. When the place was finished in this manner, and put into a proper posture of defense, it was invested, and my Uncle Toby and the corporal began to run their first parallel. I beg I may not be interrupted in my story by being told that the first parallel should be at least 300 toises distant from the main body of the place, and that I have not left a single inch for it. For my Uncle Toby took the liberty of encroaching upon his kitchen garden, for the sake of enlarging his works on the bowling green, and for that reason generally ran his first and second parallels betwixt 2 rows of his cabbages and his cauliflowers, the conveniences and inconveniences of which will be considered at large in the history of my Uncle Toby S. and the corporal's campaigns, of which this I'm now writing is but a sketch, and will be finished, if I conjecture right, in 3 pages, but there is no guessing. The campaigns themselves will take up as many books. And therefore I apprehend it would be hanging too great a weight of one kind of matter in so flimsy a performance as this, to rhapsodize them, as I once intended, into the body of the work. Surely they had better be printed apart. We'll consider the affair, so take the following sketch of them in the meantime. CHAP. LXV. When the town, with its works, was finished, my Uncle Toby and the corporal began to run their first parallel, not at random or anyhow, but from the same points and distances the allies had begun to run theirs, and regulating their approaches and attacks by the accounts my Uncle Toby received from the daily papers, they went on during the whole siege, step by step with the allies. When the Duke of Marlborough made a lodgment, my Uncle Toby made a lodgment too. And when the face of a bastion was battered down, or a defense ruined, the corporal took his mattock and did as much, and so on, gaining ground and making themselves masters of the works one after another, till the town fell into their hands. To one who took pleasure in the happy state of others, there could not have been a greater sight in world than on a post-morning, in which a practicable breach had been made by the Duke of Marlborough in the main body of the place, to have stood behind the hornbeam hedge, and observed the spirit with which my Uncle Toby, with Trim behind him, sallied forth, the one with the Gazette in his hand, the other with a spade on his shoulder to execute the contents. What an honest triumph in my Uncle Toby's looks as he marched up to the ramparts! What intense pleasure swimming in his eye as he stood over the corporal, reading the paragraph 10 times over to him, as he was at work, lest, peradventure, he should make the breach an inch too wide, or leave it an inch too narrow. But when the chamade was beat, and the corporal helped my uncle up it, and followed with the colours in his hand, to fix them upon the ramparts, heaven, earth, sea, but what avails apostrophes? With all your elements, wet or dry, ye never compounded so intoxicating a draught. In this track of happiness for many years, without one interruption to it, except now and then when the wind continued to blow due west for a week or 10 days together, which detained the Flanders mail, and kept them so long in torture. But still, 'twas the torture of the happy. In this track, I say, did my Uncle Toby and Trim move for many years, every year of which, and sometimes every month, from the invention of either the one or the other of them, adding some new conceit or quirk of improvement to their operations, which always opened fresh springs of delight in carrying them on. The first year's campaign was carried on from beginning to end, in the plain and simple method I've related. In the second year, in which my Uncle Toby took Liege and Ruremond, he thought he might afford the expense of 4 handsome drawbridges, of 2 of which I have given an exact description in the former part of my work. At the latter end of the same year, he added a couple of gates with portcullises. These last were converted afterwards into orgues as the better thing. And during the winter of the same year, my Uncle Toby, instead of a new suit of clothes, which he always had at Christmas, treated himself with a handsome sentry box, to stand at the corner of the bowling green, betwixt which point and the foot of the glacis. There was left a little kind of an esplanade for him and the corporal to confer and hold councils of war upon. The sentry box was in case of rain. All these were painted white 3 times over the ensuing spring, which enabled my Uncle Toby to take the field with great splendor. My father would often say to Yorick that if any mortal in the whole universe had done such a thing except his brother Toby, it would have been looked upon by the world as one of the most refined satires upon the parade and prancing manner in which Louis XIV, from the beginning of the war, but particularly that very year, had taken the field. But tease not my brother Toby's nature, kind soul. My father would add, to insult anyone. But let us go on. CHAP. LXVI. I must observe that although in the first year's campaign, the word town is often mentioned, yet there was no town at that time within the polygon. That addition was not made till the summer following the spring in which the bridges and sentry box were painted, which was the third year of my Uncle Toby's campaigns, when upon his taking Amberg, Bonn, and Rheinberg, and High and Limburg, one after another, a thought came into the corporal's head that to talk of taking so many towns, without one town to show for it, was a very nonsensical way of going to work, and so proposed to my Uncle Toby that they should have a little model of a town built for them, to be run up together of slit deals, and then painted, and clapped within the interior polygon to serve for all. My Uncle Toby felt the good of the project instantly, and instantly agreed to it, but with the addition of two singular improvements, of which he was almost as proud as if he had been the original inventor of the project itself. The one was, to have the town built exactly in the style of those of which it was most likely to be the representative, with grated windows and the gable ends of the houses facing the streets and sea, as those in Ghent and Bruges, and the rest of the towns in Brabant and Flanders. The other was, not to have the houses run up together, as the corporal proposed, but to have every house independent, to hook on or off, so as to form into the plan of whatever town they pleased. This was put directly into hand, and many a look of mutual congratulation was exchanged between my Uncle Toby and the corporal, as the carpenter did the work. It answered prodigiously the next summer. The town was a perfect Proteus. It was Landen and Trerebach and Samfliet and Drusen and Hagenau, and then it was Ostend and Menin and Deeth and Dendermonde. Surely never did any town act so many parts, since Sodom and Gomorrah, as my Uncle Toby's town did. In the fourth year, my Uncle Toby, thinking a town looked foolishly without a church, added a very fine one with a steeple. Trim was for having bells in it. My Uncle Toby said the metal had better be cast into cannon. This led the way the next campaign for half a dozen brass field pieces, to be planted 3 and 3 on each side of my Uncle Toby's sentry box. And in a short time, these led the way for a train of somewhat larger, and so on, as must always be the case in hobby-horsical affairs, from pieces of half-an-inch bore, till it came at last to my father's jack-boots. The next year, which was that in which Lisle was besieged, and at the close of which both Ghent and Bruges fell into our hands, my Uncle Toby was sadly put to it for proper ammunition. I say proper ammunition, because his great artillery would not bear powder. And 'twas well for the Shandy family they would not. For so full were the papers, from the beginning to the end of the siege, of the incessant firings kept up by the besiegers, and so heated was my Uncle Toby's imagination with the accounts of them, that he had infallibly shot away all his estate. Something therefore was wanting as a succedaneum, especially in one or two of the more violent paroxysms of the siege, to keep up something like a continual firing in the imagination. And this something, the corporal, whose principal strength lay in invention, supplied by an entire new system of battering of his own, without which this had been objected to by military critics, to the end of the world, as one of the great desiderata of my Uncle Toby's apparatus. This will not be explained the worse, for setting off, as I generally do, at a little distance from the subject. CHAP. LXVII. With 2 or 3 other trinkets, small in themselves, but of great regard, which poor Tom, the corporal's unfortunate brother, had sent him over, with the account of his marriage with the Jew's widow. There was a Montero cap and 2 Turkish tobacco pipes. The Montero cap I shall describe by and by. The Turkish tobacco pipes had nothing particular in them. They were fitted up and ornamented as usual, with flexible tubes of Morocco leather and gold wire, and mounted at their ends, the one of them with ivory, the other with black ebony, tipped with silver. My father, who saw all things in lights different from the rest of the world, would say to the corporal that he ought to look upon these 2 presents more as tokens of his brother's nicety than his affection. Tom did not care, Trim, he would say, to put on the cap or to smoke in the tobacco pipe of a Jew. God bless your honor, the corporal would say, giving a strong reason to the contrary. How can that be? The Montero cap was scarlet, of a superfine Spanish cloth, dyed in grain, and mounted all round with fur, except about 4 inches in the front, which was faced with a light blue, slightly embroidered, and seemed to have been the property of a Portuguese quartermaster, not of foot, but of horse, as the word denotes. The corporal was not a little proud of it, as well for its own sake, as the sake of the giver, so seldom or never put it on but upon gala days, and yet never was a Montero cap put to so many uses. For in all controverted points, whether military or culinary, provided the corporal was sure he was in the right, it was either his oath, his wager, or his gift. 'Twas his gift in the present case. "I'll be bound," said the corporal, speaking to himself, "to give away my Montero cap to the first beggar who comes to the door, if I do not manage this matter to his honor's satisfaction." The completion was no further off than the very next morning, which was that of the storm of the counterscarp betwixt the lower Dewel, to the right, and the gate St. Andrew, and on the left between St. Magdalen S. and the river. As this was the most memorable attack in the whole war, the most gallant and obstinate on both sides, and I must add the most bloody too, for it cost the Allies themselves that morning above 1,100 men, my Uncle Toby prepared himself for it with a more than ordinary solemnity. The eve which preceded, as my Uncle Toby went to bed, he ordered his Ramilly wig, which had laid inside out for many years in the corner of an old campaigning trunk which stood by his bedside, to be taken out and laid upon the lid of it, ready for the morning. And the very first thing he did in his shirt, when he had stepped out of bed, my Uncle Toby, after he had turned the rough side outwards, put it on. This done, he proceeded next to his breeches, and having buttoned the waistband, he forthwith buckled on his sword belt, and had got his sword halfway in, when he considered he should want shaving, and that it would be very inconvenient doing it with his sword on, so took it off. In essaying to put on his regimental coat and waistcoat, my Uncle Toby found the same objection in his wig, so that went off too. So that what with one thing and what with another, as always falls out when a man is in the most haste, 'twas 10 o'clock. Which was half an hour later than his usual time, before my Uncle Toby sallied out. CHAP. LXVII. My Uncle Toby had scarce turned the corner of his yew hedge, which separated his kitchen garden from his bowling green, when he perceived the corporal had begun the attack without him. Let me stop and give you a picture of the corporal's apparatus, and of the corporal himself in the height of his attack, just as it struck my Uncle Toby, as he turned towards the sentry box, where the corporal was at work. For in nature there is not such another, nor can any combination of all that is grotesque and whimsical in her works produce its equal. The corporal. Tread lightly on his ashes, ye men of genius, for he was your kinsman. Weed his grave clean, ye men of goodness, for he was your brother, O corporal. Had I thee but now that I am able to give thee a dinner and protection, how would I cherish thee? Thou shouldst wear thy Montero cap every hour of the day and every day of the week, and when it was worn out, I would purchase thee a couple like it, but alas! 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 Now that I can do this in spite of their reverences, the occasion is lost, for thou art gone. Thy genius fled up to the stars from whence it came, and that warm heart of thine, with all its generous and open vessels, compressed into a clod of the valley. But what is this to that future and dreaded page where I look towards the velvet pall, decorated with the military ensigns of thy master, the first, the foremost of created beings, where I shall see thee, faithful servant, laying his sword and scabbard with a trembling hand across his coffin, and then returning pale as ashes to the door, to take his mourning horse by the bridle, to follow his hearse, as he directed thee, where all my father's systems shall be baffled by his sorrows. And in spite of his philosophy, I shall behold him, as he inspects the lacquered plate, twice taking his spectacles from off his nose, to wipe away the dew which nature has shed upon them, when I see him cast in the rosemary with an air of disconsolation, which cries through my ears, O Toby, in what corner of the world shall I seek thy fellow? Gracious powers, which erst have opened the lips of the dumb in his distress, and made the tongue of the stammerer speak plain, when I shall arrive at this dreaded page, deal not with me, then, with a stinted hand. CHAP. LXIX. The corporal, who the night before had resolved in his mind to supply the grand desideratum of keeping up something like an incessant firing upon the enemy during the heat of the attack, had no further idea in his fancy at that time than a contrivance of smoking tobacco against the town, out of one of my Uncle Toby's 6 field pieces, which were planted on each side of his sentry box. The means of effecting which occurring to his fancy at the same time, though he had pledged his cap, he thought it in no danger from the miscarriage of his projects. Upon turning it this way, and that, a little in his mind, he soon began to find out that by means of his 2 Turkish tobacco pipes, with the supplement of 3 smaller tubes of wash leather at each of their lower ends, to be tagged by the same number of tin pipes fitted to the touch holes, and sealed with clay next the cannon, and then tied hermetically with waxed silk at their several insertions into the Morocco tube, he should be able to fire the 6 field pieces all together, and with the same ease as to fire one. Let no man say from what tags and jags hints may not be cut out for the advancement of human knowledge. Let no man, who has read my father's first and second beds of justice, ever rise up and say again, from collision of what kinds of bodies light may or may not be struck out, to carry the arts and sciences up to perfection. Heaven, thou knowest how I love them. Thou knowest the secrets of my heart, and that I would this moment give my shirt. Thou art a fool, Shandy, says Eugenius, for thou hast but a dozen in the world, and 'twill break thy set. No matter for that, Eugenius. I would give the shirt off my back to be burnt into tinder, were it only to satisfy one feverish inquirer, how many sparks at one good stroke, a good flint and steel could strike into the tail of it. Think ye not that in striking these in, he might, peradventure, strike something out, as sure as a gun? But this project by the by. The corporal sat up the best part of the night, in bringing his to perfection, and having made a sufficient proof of his cannon, with charging them to the top with tobacco, he went with contentment to bed. CHAP. LIX. The corporal had slipped out about 10 minutes before my Uncle Toby, in order to fix his apparatus, and just give the enemy a shot or two before my Uncle Toby came. He had drawn the 6 field pieces for this end, all close up together in front of my Uncle Toby's sentry box, leaving only an interval of about 1.5 yards betwixt the 3, on the right and left, for the convenience of charging and see, and the sake possibly of 2 batteries, which he might think double the honor of 1. In the rear and facing this opening, with his back to the door of the sentry box, for fear of being flanked, had the corporal wisely taken his post. He held the ivory pipe, appurtening to the battery on the right, betwixt the finger and thumb of his right hand, and the ebony pipe tipped with silver, which appertained to the battery on the left, betwixt the finger and thumb of the other, and with his right knee fixed firm upon the ground, as if in the front rank of his platoon, was the corporal. With his Montero cap upon his head, furiously playing off his 2 cross batteries at the same time against the counterguard, which faced the counterscarp, where the attack was to be made that morning. His first intention, as I said, was no more than giving the enemy a single puff or 2. But the pleasure of the puffs, as well as the puffing, had insensibly got hold of the corporal, and drawn him on from puff to puff, into the very height of the attack, by the time my Uncle Toby joined him. 'Twas well for my father that my Uncle Toby had not his will to make that day. CHAP. LXXI. My Uncle Toby took the ivory pipe out of the corporal's hand, looked at it for half a minute, and returned it. In less than 2 minutes, my Uncle Toby took the pipe from the corporal again and raised it halfway to his mouth, then hastily gave it back a second time. The corporal redoubled the attack. My Uncle Toby smiled, then looked grave, then smiled for a moment, then looked serious for a long time. "Give me hold of the ivory pipe, Trim," said my Uncle Toby. My Uncle Toby put it to his lips, drew it back directly, gave a peep over the hornbeam hedge. Never did my Uncle Toby's mouth water so much for a pipe in his life. My Uncle Toby retired into the sentry box with the pipe in his hand. Dear Uncle Toby, don't go into the sentry box with the pipe. There's no trusting a man's self with such a thing in such a corner. CHAP. LXXII. I beg the reader will assist me here, to wheel off my Uncle Toby's ordnance behind the scenes, to remove his sentry box, and clear the theater, if possible, of hornworks and half-moons, and get the rest of his military apparatus out of the way. That done, my dear friend Garrick, will snuff the candles bright, sweep the stage with a new broom, draw up the curtain, and exhibit my Uncle Toby dressed in a new character, throughout which the world can have no idea how he will act. And yet, if pity be akin to love, and bravery no alien to it, you have seen enough of my Uncle Toby in these, to trace these family likenesses betwixt the two passions, in case there is one to your heart's content. Vain science! Thou assistest us in no case of this kind, and thou puzzlest us in every one. There was, madam, in my Uncle Toby, a singleness of heart which misled him so far out of the little serpentine tracks in which things of this nature usually go on. You can have no conception of it. With this, there was a plainness and simplicity of thinking, with such an unmistrusting ignorance of the plies and foldings of the heart of woman. And so naked and defenseless did he stand before you, when a siege was out of his head, that you might have stood behind any one of your serpentine walks, and shot my Uncle Toby 10 times in a day through his liver, if 9 times in a day, madam, had not served your purpose. With all this, madam, and what confounded everything as much on the other hand, my Uncle Toby had that unparalleled modesty of nature I once told you of, and which, by the by, stood eternal sentry upon his feelings, that you might as soon— But where am I going? These reflections crowd in upon me 10 pages at least too soon, and take up that time, which I ought to bestow upon facts. Chap. LXXII. Of the few legitimate sons of Adam whose breasts never felt what the sting of love was, maintaining first all misogynists to be bastards, the greatest heroes of ancient and modern story have carried off amongst them 9 parts in 10 of the honor. And I wish for their sakes I had the key of my study, out of my draw-well, only for 5 minutes, to tell you their names. Recollect them I cannot, so be content to accept of these, for the present, in their stead. There was the great King Aldrovandus, and Bosphorus, and Cappadocius, and Dardanus, and Pontus, and Asius, to say nothing of the iron-hearted Charles the Zaith, whom the Countess of K herself could make nothing of. There was Babylonicus, and Mediterraneus, and Polixenes, and Persicus, and Prusicus, not one of whom, except Cappadocius and Pontus, who were both a little suspected, ever once bowed down his breast to the goddess. The truth is, they had all of them something else to do. And so had my Uncle Toby, till fate, I say, envying his name the glory of being handed down to posterity with Aldrovandus S. and the rest, she basely patched up the peace of Utrecht. Believe me, sirs, 'twas the worst deed she did that year. Chap. LXXIV. Amongst the many ill consequences of the Treaty of Utrecht, it was within a point of giving my Uncle Toby a surfeit of sieges. And though he recovered his appetite afterwards, yet Calais itself left not a deeper scar in Mary's heart than Utrecht upon my Uncle Toby S. To the end of his life, he never could hear Utrecht mentioned upon any account whatever, or so much as read an article of news extracted out of the Utrecht Gazette, without fetching a sigh, as if his heart would break in twain. My father, who was a great motivemonger, and consequently a very dangerous person for a man to sit by, either laughing or crying, for he generally knew your motive for doing both, much better than you knew it yourself, would always console my Uncle Toby upon these occasions, in a way, which showed plainly, he imagined my Uncle Toby grieved for nothing in the whole affair, so much as the loss of his hobby-horse. Never mind, brother Toby. He would say, by God's blessing we shall have another war break out again some of these days, and when it does, the belligerent powers, if they would hang themselves, cannot keep us out of play. I defy 'em, my dear Toby, he would add, to take countries without taking towns, or towns without sieges. My Uncle Toby never took this backstroke of my father's at his hobby-horse kindly. He thought the stroke ungenerous, and the more so, because in striking the horse he hit the rider too, and in the most dishonorable part a blow could fall. So that upon these occasions, he always laid down his pipe upon the table with more fire to defend himself than common. I told the reader, this time 2 years, that my Uncle Toby was not eloquent, and in the very same page gave an instance to the contrary. I repeat the observation, and a fact which contradicts it again. He was not eloquent. It was not easy to my Uncle Toby to make long harangues, and he hated florid ones. But there were occasions where the stream overflowed the man, and ran so counter to its usual course, that in some parts my Uncle Toby, for a time, was at least equal to Tertullus, but in others, in my own opinion, infinitely above him. My father was so highly pleased with one of these apologetical orations of my Uncle Toby S., which he had delivered one evening before him and Yorick, that he wrote it down before he went to bed. I have had the good fortune to meet with it amongst my father's papers, with here and there an insertion of his own, betwixt two crooks, thus, and is endorsed, my brother Tobys' justification of his own principles and conduct in wishing to continue the war. I may safely say, I have read over this apologetical oration of my Uncle Toby 100 times, and think it so fine a model of defense, and shows so sweet a temperament of gallantry and good principles in him, that I give it the world, word for word, interlineations and all, as I find it. CHAP. LXXV. My Uncle Toby's apologetical oration. I am not insensible, Brother Shandy, that when a man whose profession is arms wishes, as I have done, for war, it has an ill aspect to the world, and that, how just and right soever his motives the intentions may be, he stands in an uneasy posture in vindicating himself from private views in doing it. For this cause, if a soldier is a prudent man, which he may be without being a jot the less brave, he will be sure not to utter his wish in the hearing of an enemy. For say what he will, an enemy will not believe him. He will be cautious of doing it even to a friend, lest he may suffer in his esteem. But if his heart is overcharged, and a secret sigh for arms must have its vent, he will reserve it for the ear of a brother, who knows his character to the bottom, and what his true notions, dispositions, and principles of honor are. What I hope have been in all these, Brother Shandy, would be unbecoming in me to say. Much worse, I know, have I been than I ought, and something worse, perhaps, than I think. But such as I am, you, my dear Brother Shandy, who have sucked the same breasts with me, and with whom I have been brought up from my cradle, and from whose knowledge from the first hours of our boyish pastimes, down to this, I have concealed no one action of my life, and scarce a thought in it. Such as I am, brother, you must by this time know me, with all my vices and with all my weaknesses too, whether of my age, my temper, my passions, or my understanding. Tell me then, my dear Brother Shandy, upon which of them it is that when I condemned the peace of Utrecht, and grieved the war was not carried on with vigor a little longer, you should think your brother did it upon unworthy views, or that in wishing for war, he should be bad enough to wish more of his fellow creatures slain, more slaves made, and more families driven from their peaceful habitations, merely for his own pleasure. Tell me, Brother Shandy, upon what one deed of mine do you ground it? The devil a deed do I know of, dear Toby, but one for 100 pounds, which I lent thee to carry on these cursed sieges. If, when I was a schoolboy, I could not hear a drum beat, but my heart beat with it, was it my fault? Did I plant the propensity there? Did I sound the alarm within, or nature? When Guy, Earl of Warwick, and Parismus and Parismenus, and Valentine and Orson, and the 7 champions of England were handed around the school, were they not all purchased with my own pocket money? Was that selfish, Brother Shandy? When we read over the siege of Troy, which lasted 10 years and 8 months, though with such a train of artillery as we had at Namur, the town might have been carried in a week, was I not as much concerned for the destruction of the Greeks and Trojans as any boy of the whole school? Had I not 3 strokes of a ferula given me, 2 on my right hand and 1 on my left, for calling Helena a bitch for it? Did any one of you shed more tears for Hector? And when King Priam came to the camp to beg his body, and returned weeping back to Troy without it, you know, brother, I could not eat my dinner. Did that bespeak me cruel? Or because, Brother Shandy, my blood flew out into the camp, and my heart panted for war, was it a proof it could not ache for the distresses of war too? Oh, brother, 'tis one thing for a soldier to gather laurels, and 'tis another to scatter cypress. Who told thee, my dear Toby, that cypress was used by the anti-ants on mournful occasions? 'Tis one thing, Brother Shandy, for a soldier to hazard his own life, to leap first down into the trench, where he is sure to be cut in pieces. 'Tis one thing, from public spirit and a thirst of glory, to enter the breach the first man, to stand in the foremost rank, and march bravely on with drums and trumpets, and colors flying about his ears. 'Tis one thing, I say, Brother Shandy, to do this, and 'tis another thing to reflect on the miseries of war, to view the desolations of whole countries, and consider the intolerable fatigues and hardships which the soldier himself, the instrument who works them, is forced, for 6 pence a day, if he can get it, to undergo. Need I be told, dear Yorick, as I was by you, in Lefever's funeral sermon, that so soft and gentle a creature, born to love, to mercy, and kindness as man is was not shaped for this. But why did you not add, Yorick, if not by nature, that he is so by necessity? For what is war? What is it, Yorick, when fought as ours has been, upon principles of liberty and upon principles of honor? What is it, but the getting together of quiet and harmless people, with their swords in their hands, to keep the ambitious and the turbulent within bounds? And heaven is my witness, brother Shandy, that the pleasure I have taken in these things, and that infinite delight in particular, which has attended my sieges in my bowling green, has arose within me, and I hope in the corporal too, from the consciousness we both had, that in carrying them on, we were answering the great ends of our creation. CHAP. LXXVI. I told the Christian reader, I say Christian, hoping he is one, and if he is not, I am sorry for it, and only beg he will consider the matter with himself, and not lay the blame entirely upon this book. I told him, sir, for in good truth, when a man is telling a story in the strange way I do mine, he is obliged continually to be going backwards and forwards to keep all tight together in the reader's fancy. Which, for my own part, if I did not take heed to do more than at first, there is so much unfixed and equivocal matter starting up, with so many breaks and gaps in it, and so little service do the stars afford, which nevertheless I hang up in some of the darkest passages. Knowing that the world is apt to lose its way, with all the lights the sun itself at noonday can give it, and now you see I am lost myself. But 'tis my father's fault, and whenever my brains come to be dissected, you will perceive without spectacles that he has left a large uneven thread, as you sometimes see in an unsalable piece of cambric, running along the whole length of the web, and so untowardly you cannot so much as cut out an asterisk. Here I hang up a couple of lights again, or a fillet, or a thumbstall, but it is seen or felt. Quanto id diligentias in liberis procrendis cavendum, saith Cardan. All which being considered, and that you see 'tis morally impracticable for me to wind this round to where I set out. I begin the chapter over again. CHAP. LXXVI. I told the Christian reader in the beginning of the chapter, which preceded my Uncle Toby's apologetical oration, though in a different trope from what I should make use of now, that the piece of Utrecht was within an ace of creating the same shyness betwixt my Uncle Toby and his hobby horse, as it did betwixt the Queen and the rest of the confederating powers. There is an indignant way in which a man sometimes dismounts his horse, which, as good as says to him, I'll go afoot, sir, all the days of my life before I would ride a single mile upon your back again. Now my Uncle Toby could not be said to dismount his horse in this manner, for in strictness of language, he could not be said to dismount his horse at all. His horse rather flung him, and somewhat viciously, which made my Uncle Toby take it 10 times more unkindly. Let this matter be settled by state jockeys as they like. It created, I say, a sort of shyness betwixt my Uncle Toby and his hobby horse. He had no occasion for him from the month of March to November, which was the summer after the articles were signed, except it was now and then to take a short ride out, just to see that the fortifications and harbor of Dunkirk were demolished, according to stipulation. The French were so backwards all that summer in setting about that affair, and Monsieur Tugg, the deputy from the magistrates of Dunkirk, presented so many affecting petitions to the Queen, beseeching Her Majesty to cause only her thunderbolts to fall upon the martial works, which might have incurred her displeasure, but to spare the mole for the mole's sake, which in its naked situation could be no more than an object of pity, and the Queen, who was but a woman, being of a pitiful disposition, and her ministers also, they not wishing in their hearts to have the town dismantled for these private reasons. So that the whole went heavily on with my Uncle Toby, insomuch that it was not within 3 full months, after he and the corporal had constructed the town, and put it in a condition to be destroyed, that the several commandants, commissaries, deputies, negotiators, and intendants would permit him to set about it. Fatal interval of inactivity. The corporal was for beginning the demolition, by making a breach in the ramparts or main fortifications of the town. No, that will never do, corporal, said my Uncle Toby, for in going that way to work with the town, the English garrison will not be safe in it an hour, because if the French are treacherous, they are as treacherous as devils, and please your honor, said the corporal. It gives me concern always when I hear it, Trim, said my Uncle Toby, for they don't want personal bravery, and if a breach